difficult. Said that today we're up to Gimel. Now we're going to try to classify various karbonos. This is real Kodshim. Yeah, please. But I do, Don, to open the window. Maybe you have a better method. This is you have a better method. Twist it. Oh, okay. I didn't. I have a whole, very primitive method. I push against the window. And so most like the most fundamental distinction in Kodshim is between what we call Kedushas Haguf and Kedushas Domim. In fact, I if you're in the mood for my treating you as students, if you're in that mood, I'm going to actually write this on the board. The only thing is I need an eraser. I'm erasing my own writing, so I don't have to ask anyone for permission. So we have Kiddush Haguf, right? And we have Kiddushas Dom. Okay? And these terms have synonyms. Mamish synonyms, identical. This is called Kiddushas Mizbeach, and this is called Kiddushas Bedek Habayis. So again, this is, I'm talking to you like first graders, so you'll be moichel. So once you makdish a carbon, it has Kiddushas Haguf, because it belongs on the Mizbeach. But then there's another Kedusha called Bedek Habayis, which means I'm not being Magdish the object, really, but rather the value of the object. The object is a physical manifestation of an abstract value. And the most fundamental difference, even before we get to Tmura, is Pidyon. Because here, Kedushas Dom means it's only the value. Dom means the value of the object. So I can transfer the Kedusha onto another object that has a similar value. But not so in Saguf, because Kedusha Saguf is the Kedusha, so to speak, penetrates into every fiber of the animal. You can't take it out. Now, this distinction about Pidyon has an exception to it. Like everything in the Torah has an exception to it. And that's what's called a move. So that if you have, this is all a tam, right? Which is a perfect unblemished animal. And then, moving down here, because I ran out of space, you have something called a Baal Mum. Once the animal has a mum in it, it loses its Kedusha Guf, which is my value. Because how can you remove Kedusha Guf? But the answer is it's no longer fit for the Mizbeach. The moment it becomes unfit for the Mizbeach, then by definition, it loses its forfeits its Kedusha Guf, and now it goes down one level to Kedushas Dom. And once it does so, you can be poded and transferred. Now the term Bedek Habayis is a little bit misleading. Bedek Habayis doesn't mean literally that we're going to use it to construct the bias. I mean, the bias is already constructed. We don't need more stones or anything else. But Bedek Habayis means that it's designated for Hegdish. Now, once again, this is a little bit misleading because you might literally translate Hegdish as sanctity. Well, this is also Hegdish. But here I'm specifically talking about this kind of Hegdish, which is Kedushas Dom. And the real, if you want to show off that you're allowed to, a big Talmud Chacham, so Hegdish is what's called Mamon Hegdish B'Kidyana, which means, I'm going to give a marshal, I should be shot for this, but take, for example, the Vatican. The Vatican is probably the largest conglomerate in the world. They produce their own money. They have their own city. Their own laws. If you go into the Vatican. So what I mean to say is that the greatest corporation in the world is probably the Vatican. But lahavdil elf havdalos, when we get to Torah, our greatest enterprise, our greatest company financially is Hegdish. And who represents Hegdish? Anybody know what that's called? Like, for example, if I make something Hegdish, I bring it to the Gizmo. Now, I'm sure there's a fancy English word for Gizmo. I don't know what it is. But it's called the treasurer. Treasurer. Now, what we're going to try to figure out is whether Tamura works. We'll call this A, okay? And then we'll call this B. Does Tamura apply to both A and B, or only to A? And another way of saying it is, if it only applies to A and not to B, what would happen if it's a Baal Mum? So again, I have an animal that's Hegdesh L'Mizbeach, and I point to it and I say, now I have an animal that's Chulin, and I point to it and I say, Harei Zu Tmura Zu. No, I'm sorry, I got it wrong again. Harei Zu Tmura Zu. Right, this is my animal that's Chulin, and I look at it and I say, Harei Zu Tmura Zu. That this one, the chulin, should be a replacement for this one. So that certainly applies in classic Kedusha Guf. What about a Balmum? Do we assume that once the animal becomes Balmum, it forfeits its original status as Kedusha Guf, and now it really belongs to Kedushas Perek Habayis or Kedushas Damin, and there's no Tamura in Kedushas Damin. There's Pidyon in Kedushas Damin, but not Tamura. All right. The field? No. There are cases where what's called Yirad Shiastayev, those are cases where we don't know whether we can bring it on the Mizbeach, but it may have to do just Haguf. So in that, suffix situation, it's not a Balmum. So we have to create a Balmum, but we're not allowed to make a move in the Behemoth's Kodesh. So what we do is we leave it out there and hope it'll swallow a nail. All right, so let's read it inside. Ein memirin ela keduche mizbeach. He has a footnote here, Lamed Zayin. Oh, shuck.
Turn it on the other page.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, no, the way he photocopied. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Forget it. It's not important. Lamed Zayin. Re'ela halon. Memirin dafka b'kodshim mizbeach hakedoshim b'keduchas haguf. All right, I guess lahalon means that he hasn't. This is not the place where he's going to quote the sources, but later on he'll quote the source. Behem hakodshim she'omdim la'akrava b'mizbeach below kodshei perek habayis she'enam omdim la'akrava b'mizbeach. Oh, he points out here, which in my mind is obvious. Number lamed ches, afilu behema kedosha b'kedushas perek habayis. Perek habayis doesn't necessarily mean that I designate a table for perek habayis, or a stone, or a brick, or money. It could even be a behema. So you're looking at a behema, and somebody says to you, "Well, that's hegdish." What does he mean by that? It can mean one or two things that are radically different. He can either mean that it has Kedushas Haguf because it's Hegdesh because you are Magdish at the Mizbeach, or he might mean that it's Hegdesh with Kedushas Damin, it's Perek Habayis. Again, you're not going to use the animal as a brick, but you'll sell the animal on the market, which is a pigeon, and take the money and use it to construct them, fix the Beis HaMikdash. So I don't see anything here about a Balmum. Oh, okay. I jumped the gun. So we're going to get to Balmum later. But the next two words on the page are paraduma. And I'm not going to look because that's the way I am. I like to try to challenge myself to see what's coming around the bend. So I did not look. So if I get it really wrong, so you'll say, all right, I didn't look. If I get it right, I got it right. So what's paraduma? Paraduma is very common. Is it Kedushas Haguf or not? we don't bring the paraduma on the mizbeach. We're going to burn it, and we're going to use its ashes for a concoction called mechatos in order to be mitaret tmei mace. But the Torah itself calls paraduma a chatos, which means it defies all the rules that we're dealing with. So if I have a paraduma and I say harei zu tmura zu, then it could very well be that this is a Maisa Tmura because paraduma was elevated to the status of Kodshim by the Torah, because the Torah calls it a chatas, even though it's not a chatas.
But only if the other one's another paraduma? I mean, if it was some other kind of animal.
I mean, what does it mean to say harei zu tmura zu if it's not if it couldn't qualify for paraduma? Let's hold off with your question. Let's see what he says. Para aduma, Eina osa tmura. I'm disappointed. I was hoping it would be osa tmura. I like to look for the exceptions to the rule. The afshi kriya chatos. Let's see if he tells you. He tells you where to look in the Gemara. I thought he was going to tell you where to look in the Torah. The Torah calls it chatos. The fisha eina kodshim mizbeach el kodshe berek habayis. Mem aleph. Gemara. What does that say? Chaf. Re'ei tosus madua svaras chatos karya rachmana eino tam sheteyos etmu. So apparently Tosus is going to address our question that since the Torah calls it chatos, it should therefore be elevated to the status of tmura. It should be subject to tmura. See, he doesn't address your question, Steve, because your question becomes theoretical. We can only ask in the Havamina, what kind of an animal is he? Me to believe, to find one part two is hard enough. We'll find another one. So where is this? Nema Aleph, Chaf Amid Aleph. You want to quickly bring a Gemara Tmura and see if you find anything there? Tmura Chaf. Chaf Chaf. See, I'll tell you what I would say, and I may be way off. The Havamina that Tmura would apply to a paraduma is because the Torah calls it a chatas. Do you hear what I'm saying, Steve? The Havamina that Tmura would work is because the Torah calls paraduma chatas. So if you take another animal which could become a chatas, then it's possible that the Tmura would allow you to take that element of a paraduma, which is chatas, that dimension, and transpose it onto the behemoth chulin. And now the behemoth chulin becomes behemoth kodshim mizbeach because of the tmura for a chatas, not the tmura of a paraduma. So the paraduma is like a schizophrenic; it has two personalities.
But there's no mention that we're not having the paraduma as a organ. So.
But if Torah calls it a chatas, it means it has kedushas chatas. And if it has kedushas chatas, then again you have to see what dinim we derive. He quotes the Gemara Chulin. We don't have time for that right now. But there are nafkaminas to the fact that paraduma has the dimension of chatas. And we would have said that one of those nafkaminas would be tmura. So that I could take a behemoth chulin and through a ma'isa tmura, impose on it the kedushas chatas of a paraduma. Not the kedushas paraduma of a paraduma, because it's not a paraduma. You can't take something and make it into a paraduma. You got to be born a paraduma. So, Steve, you're on Daf Chaf?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kodshe berek habayis hu v'kodshe berek habayis lo big.
Right.
Into the paraduma.
But it doesn't say anything about chatas there.
No.
So that he tells you to look at Tosas Kula, but I'm not going to bother you with that. If you want to do that as extra credit work, we'll give you an A+ in the course. All right, what else? Minakosu tmuraso, doshu chacham tmuraso v'lo tmuras tmuraso. She'ein behemas tmura osa tmura. Interesting. So the Havamina here was that you could have a domino theory. So you have animal A, which is Kodshim Mizbeach, animal B is a tmura, and animal C is a tmura of B. And you can keep going ad infinitum. But the Gemara Darshans that says tmurasa below tmuras tmuras. So I'm not sure how to learn the maskana. I understand what the din is. The law is that the second tmura, if you follow what I mean, the tmuras tmura is not a tmura. It remains chul. But I'm not sure why. In my mind, there are two logical possibilities. One is either because you simply can't do a Maisa Tmura on a Behemoth Tmura. The other possibility is that the Behemoth Tmura does not have the identical Kedusha as the original Behemoth Kodshim. And in order to create a Tmura, you need the original Kedusha full blast. Like let's say on a scale of 100, 0 to 100, it could be the Behemoth Kodshim has 100 and a Behemoth Tmura has 90. And 90 is not 100. It's not enough to create another Tmura. You need 100. Or maybe it has nothing to do with that. The Behemoth Tmura is exactly identical Kedusha, but you don't have a Maisa Tmura. You can't do a Maisa Tmura except on the original Behemoth Kodshim, but not on a clone of the Behemoth Kodshim. Yeah, I don't know beans about the cloning theory, but this is, al derech hamashal. You can talk about cloning of you. Making a clone of a clone. Is a clone of a clone the same as a clone? Probably it is, but I don't know. I'm not sure. Anybody want to Google that? I'd be curious to know.
It's the same DNA. Theoretically, it has.
But I think they saw a decrease in life expectancy.
Really?
Where they do it in Australia? Sounds like an Australian thing. They have plenty of sheep.
They get the sheep in there.
Have they cloned a human being yet?
No,
Because there's a whole sugi in the Gemara about whether we can create a human being. In any event, Minakosov, so that we saw, what's Membeis? To Mishnah on Yud Gimel. Fine.
So even though we say you can't do tomorrow, it's still be allowed?
No, I don't think so.
Not be allowed. Sorry, the
Right.
first one will be allowed. but the second
Correct. Because it's not a Maisa Tmura. Lo never Tmura, ela b'behema v'lo ba'ofos u'menachos. Wow, that's a chiddush. He tells you to look in the Shara Melech. I think I have one. But there is a Shita Rabbi Yehuda, Yesh Tmura ba'ofos, which honestly makes a lot of sense. I mean, why should an oaf be different than a behemoth? I think we once discussed that there are differences between ophos and behemoth. For that, I would have to go into our archives here. She'ein memirin me ophos u'menachos shel kodesh al behemas chulin. Okay, that's understandable, but v'chein ein memirin al ophos shel chulin me behemas kodesh. It works in both directions. Let's say you have a behemas hegdej, and you have an oaf that's chulin, and you want to say zu tmura zu. That's not a ma'aseh tmura. V'chein ein memirin me ophos u'menachos al ophos u'menachos. That's the real McCoy chiddush over here. That ostensibly an oaf could have the same kedushas mizbeach as a behema, but yet there's no ma'aseh tmura on a behemas oath. Excuse me, on a kodshe oath. Menachas is already a whole different category, so that I understand. Mem Daled, Ein Mavur B'Torah's Kam. See, unfortunately, this Hakdama doesn't give you much. His goal is just to give you the basics. Oh, now we get to Baal Mum. This is what I was asking you at the beginning of our discussion. What's the status of a Baal Mum? Is it subject to a Maisa Tmura? Can you use it for a Maisa Tmura or not? In my humble opinion, I would say not, because it's not Kodshim Mizbeach anymore. It's forfeited its status. But let's see what he says. V'nakosov tov b'ra, o ra b'tov, right? That's the original pasuk of Tmura. Darshan chachamim shememirim behemas hegdesh balas mum b'ofen shekadam hakdosha es muma. In other words, this animal has a history. Originally, it was a tam when he made it hegdish. So he declared a behema as hegdish, and it's a tam. Then it became a balmum. So at least it has the roots and the bones, so to speak, of a hegdish tam. That's called kadma hakdosha es muma. And in such a case, since the Torah says, oh, ra b'tov, you can do a maisa tmura on such an animal, which was kadam ekdeshas muma, and now it's about mum, on a behemas chulin tmima. This is interesting. I mean, there are two chidushim here that I see. Number one, that there is a maisa tmura on a balas mum, which is an animal that cannot be brought to the mizbeach. And the second chiddush is that even though I grant you that you do have a maisa tmura on a balas mum, but it's only on a behemas chulin, which is a tam, a tvima. If the behemas chulin itself is a balas mum, now you would have said, wait a minute, these they're equal. This one's a baal mum and this one's a baal mum. And if there's tmura from a baal mum to a chulin, then who cares if the chulin is a baal mum or not? Why should I give a hoot? It's no worse than the behemas Kodshim, which is the source for the tmura. But he's saying no. Does he quote any source for it? No. He says, Bir tam din said, Shebal mum yochel lahamir, lefi ma, shekos, b'chidusha b'chaim, she'af li'acha she'human, ino nas dushas domim, mishum mum shebo, ela mishum sheyesh bo, efsharus pidyon. Mom, nasta kiddushas. Hear what he's saying? In this footnote, it starts on one page and finishes on the next. It finishes on page Dalit. I understand this correctly, saying something pretty revolutionary. This halacha that you could be meimer from a behemas balmum is not just a simple halacha. It really sheds a whole new light on the status of a behemas balmum. We think that the fact that the animal is blemished, that itself lowers the level of kedusha from kedushas mizbeach to kedushas domin. And I'll prove it to you, because now you can be poda, and you can only be poda kedushas domin. So it must be that an animal mizbeach that now became a Balmum sinks down, it downgrades from Kedushas Haguf to Kedushas Dolim. So he quotes Reb Chaim, and Reb Chaim says that's not true at all. The only reason it has Kedushas Dolim is because now the Torah allows pidyon. The Torah allows you to be podeh and transfer the value of the animal, its market value, over to coins or currency, whatever you want to do. But as far as the animal itself is concerned, if I isolate the mum and talk about the status of the animal with a mum in it, it still remains Kedushas Mizbeach. The original Kedusha is still there. We call it Kedushas Damim, not because of the mum, but rather because the Torah allowed you to do a pidyon. And the nafkamina here is Tmura. If I would have told you that the fact that it has mum just completely strips it of its Kedushas Haguf, then there's no Maisa Tmura on something that doesn't have Kedushas Haguf. How could I do a Tmura on an animal that's a Baal Mum? It doesn't have Kedushas Haguf. And I'll prove it to you because it's pidyon. There's no pidyon for anything other than Kedushas Perek HaBayis, Kedushas Damin. It says Reb Chaim, there's something in the middle. It's neither this nor that. It's not a full-fledged Kedushas Haguf, and I prove that to you from the fact that it lends itself to pidyon, and there's no pidyon on Kedushas Haguf. But it's not Kedushas Damin. The Torah allows you to effectuate a pidyon, but it's not Kedushas Damin. The mum itself does not have that, shall I say, profound ability or impact on the animal to strip it of its Kedushas Haguf. And I'll prove it to you because it's still Tmura. And there's no Tmura on Kedushas Damin. So the Torah sort of like had a, what's the word I want to use? Oh, if you can help me with this, not a dispensation, but a concession, maybe I'll call it that. Like this Torah made a concession in the case of a Baal Mum, allowing you to be poded. You follow what I mean by a concession? Maybe that's not a good word.
Because I thought if it loses, if it has a mum, then it loses.
Trust me, Don, that's what everyone, including myself, believes.
No,
Everyone on the face of the earth, except for a cock.
Because this argument is saying because of this we're doing that, but it's person.
Correct. I'm saying before this Reb Chaim, there's the life before Reb Chaim.
Okay.
You know, Reb Chaim had a mechut. His name was Feinstein, Reb Elia Feinstein. So Reb Elia Feinstein, when they asked him about Reb Chaim, he says, "Ich bin farma in Torah," meaning with Reb Chaim there was a whole new Matan Torah. I come from the generation before Matan Torah. That's how he expressed it. You know, he wasn't ready for the revolutions of Reb Chaim. His daughter, his name was Tesha, was married to Rav Moshe Soloveitch. Anyway, so Reb Chaim has a revolution. He's saying it's not the way we think of it, that once there's a mum, the animal forfeits Kedushas Haguf. But rather, once there's a mum, the Torah allowed you to be poded this animal. But it really, in its essence, nothing has changed in its essential Kedusha as a result of the mum. I wish I could give you an example of this. No, I can't give you an example. I have a philosophical example, but not a halachic. Like, for example, I have to think of an afkamina. You know, if I sell you a property, real estate in a walled city that was walled from the time of Yeshua, then I have rights to buy back that field up to 12 months. Yeah. That's at the end of Sefer Vayikra. So the seller could so to speak, buy it back. Now, what happens after the last day of the 12 months? And there are two possibilities. One possibility is to say that the seller loses his possession over that field. Whatever possession, it's called a stay achuza, achuza miloshin, and I grab onto it. Whatever additional acquisition and ownership rights I had terminate, when Cinderella turns into Cinderella, 12 midnight after 12 months. You know what I mean? The other way of saying it is that no, what the Torah wanted to do is give a concession to protect the interests of the buyer. The buyer put down his money, knowing that, he may lose the field at some point. Again, he'll get reimbursed, but at some point he wants to know, so to speak, on a moral level, that he gets full possession of. So the Torah, it still remains a stay achusa, really, of the original owner, but he no longer has rights to be poded because Lokeach now is given the property rights to block the pigeon. You follow what I'm saying? Anyway, so this is Reb Chaim. But again, there's a powerful argument. I mean, how can you have Tmura on a Baal Mum? It's really very, very paradoxical. V'chein, let's see if we can fit in one more line here. V'chein memirin behemas hegesh tmima al behemas chulin balaskum. Oh, now it works in the opposite direction. Ach ein memirin. Oh, okay. So this is already. So we have something called a behemas chulin balaskum on the top of page down. That's where we're going to start in Mitzvah Shem tomorrow, correct? Okay, then let's